They shaved the dog's fur for laughs. They beat it until it stopped resisting. Left alone in a forgotten place, stripped of dignity, stripped of hope. What they didn't know was this dog was never ordinary. It wasn't broken, it was waiting. When a lone Navy SEAL crossed its path, something ancient awakened. Loyalty, purpose, a bond forged by pain and guided by God. What followed would expose a hidden evil and reveal a miracle no one expected. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter presses down on Spokane like a held breath, snow-muted streets, abandoned structures at the city's edge, and a silence that carries old violence waiting to be remembered. Ethan Walker did not come back to the city because he missed it. He returned because movement was easier than stillness, and silence in unfamiliar streets hurt less than silence in familiar rooms. Spokane in winter had a way of dulling sound and thought at the same time, wrapping everything in white until even memories seemed padded, unable to strike too sharply. For Ethan, that mattered. He had learned that the mind, when left alone, could be louder than gunfire. At 25, Ethan carried himself with the restraint of someone older. He moved through the cold with the economy of motion, drilled into him by years of training, though he no longer wore a unit patch that explained who he was or why he walked the way he did. The uniform he still owned felt less like an identity and more like a second skin he could not yet shed. He told himself it was temporary. Everything was temporary. That was the promise he repeated when the nights grew long. He had been assigned nothing, ordered nowhere. That freedom should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a frozen river, unsure whether the ice would hold. Without a mission, his thoughts circled inward. He slept lightly, waking at sounds that no longer existed. He counted exits in grocery stores. He watched hands more than faces. The habits remained because letting them go felt dangerous, as if vigilance itself were the last barrier between order and collapse. That afternoon he walked beyond the plowed roads, following a half-buried service path that led toward the outskirts. The structures there were skeletal, their purpose long stripped away. Fences leaned at angles, suggesting they had given up resisting gravity. Ethan told himself he was only walking, only burning time. But part of him recognized the pull. Places like this, abandoned, forgotten, often held truths that crowded streets concealed. He heard laughter first. It was not loud, not joyful. It had the flatness of boredom being entertained. Ethan slowed. He did not move closer yet. He listened the way he had learned to listen before entering unknown territory. His body reacted before his thoughts formed words. Muscles tightened, breath steadied. The cold sharpened everything. From where he stood, he could see a fenced enclosure and a structure that might once have been useful. A group of men lingered nearby, their movements careless. What held Ethan's attention, though, was the stillness at the center of it all, a shape behind the fence, a presence that did not pace or bark or demand attention. It simply existed. The dog did not look at him at first. It faced forward, as if the world beyond the fence no longer mattered. Ethan felt something twist in his chest, not pity exactly, but recognition. He had seen that posture before in mirrors and reflections, the body present, the mind withdrawn to a place where pain could not reach as easily. One of the men tossed something into the enclosure. The dog did not move. Another man laughed, sharper this time, and said something Ethan could not hear clearly. There was a gesture, dismissive, followed by more laughter. Ethan's jaw tightened. He told himself to keep walking. This was not his mission. These were not his orders. Intervening without authority had consequences, and consequences were easier to manage when they were anticipated, planned, justified. But the dog lifted its head. The movement was minimal, almost reluctant, yet it carried a weight that stopped Ethan cold. The animal's gaze was not wild or pleading. It was alert in a way that spoke of restraint rather than submission. There was no panic in it, no confusion, only awareness. Ethan felt the familiar internal argument ignite. The voice of discipline told him this was none of his concern. The voice of experience reminded him how quickly situations escalated when emotions overruled judgment. He had seen what happened when lines were crossed without preparation. People died. Missions failed. Regret followed like a shadow that never shortened. Another voice, quieter, harder to categorize, asked a different question. What happens if you walk away? That voice had grown louder since his return. It spoke in moments when he witnessed small injustices, the kind that never made reports or briefings. He had spent years confronting large, sanctioned violence, actions justified by objectives and outcomes. This was different. This was small, personal, and disturbingly familiar. Power used because it could be, cruelty disguised as entertainment. The men moved closer to the fence. One of them reached through the bars. The dog did not retreat. It did not advance either. It remained still, watching. Ethan noticed the tension in its posture, not fear, but containment, as if something inside it had been taught to wait, to endure, to hold back until released. That was when Ethan understood. This was not a stray that had learned to survive by chance. This was a creature shaped by structure, by command, by rules that no longer applied. Someone had taught it discipline, someone had taught it restraint, and someone had abandoned it when that discipline became inconvenient. The realization unsettled him more than the men's laughter. Abandonment, he had learned, left deeper wounds than direct harm. Harm could be met, resisted, processed. Abandonment lingered, eroding trust until even rescue felt suspect. Ethan took a step forward, then stopped. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the weight of choice. He imagined approaching, imagined confrontation, imagined the ripple of consequences that would follow. He imagined the dog reacting, not unpredictably, but decisively, and wondered whether that would make him responsible for whatever came next. The men eventually grew bored. One of them spat into the snow. They turned away, voices fading as they walked off, leaving the enclosure as they had found it, empty of care, full of silence. Ethan waited until they were gone before moving closer. The dog turned its head slightly, acknowledging him without alarm. Their eyes met. In that moment, Ethan felt an unfamiliar hesitation. He had approached armed combatants with less uncertainty. This was different. This required something he had not practiced as thoroughly: trust without command. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly, unsure why he spoke at all. The dog did not react to the words, but it did not turn away either. That was enough. Ethan did not open the gate. He did not reach through the fence. He stood there, letting the cold seep into his boots, letting the silence stretch. He studied the dog's breathing, the way it held itself together through sheer will. He saw not weakness, but exhaustion. Not defeat, but suspension. A thought surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. This is what happens when missions end without closure. You were trained for a purpose, used for that purpose, then left behind when the context changed. Ethan pushed the thought away, yet it lingered, insistent. He knew he would leave soon. He also knew he would come back. That knowledge settled over him with unexpected clarity. Whatever he did next would not be impulsive. He would observe. He would learn. He would decide when he understood the full shape of the situation. That, at least, was something he could still do well. As he turned away, the dog shifted for the first time, adjusting its stance. It did not follow. It did not call out. But Ethan felt the weight of its awareness on his back, a presence that lingered even as distance grew. Walking back toward the city, Ethan felt the old restlessness stir, but it was different now, sharper, focused. He told himself it was nothing, just another image his mind would carry until sleep dulled it. Yet beneath that reassurance was a quieter truth he could not deny. Something had recognized him, and he had recognized it in return. That night, Ethan dreamed of fences and open gates, of orders given and rescinded, of standing still while the world decided what to do with what remained. When he woke, the decision he had been avoiding felt inevitable. Morning settles over Spokane in brittle cold, the kind that preserves footprints and intentions alike, turning yesterday's silence into something that demands to be faced rather than avoided. Ethan woke before dawn, the way he always did when his mind refused to loosen its grip. The image of the enclosure returned immediately, sharper than any dream. He lay still, staring at the ceiling of the small rented room, listening to the building's quiet creaks as heat pipes fought the cold. He told himself it was just another scene his brain had filed away, no different from countless others. Yet his body disagreed. His pulse was already elevated, breath shallow, as if he were preparing to move. He replayed the moment when the dog lifted its head. Not the men's laughter, not the fence, but that single movement. It carried intention. Ethan had spent years learning to read intention where words failed. In hostile environments, hesitation meant death. Control meant survival. That dog had been controlled, not broken. The distinction mattered, and it unsettled him more than overt fear ever could. Ethan rose and dressed without thought, movements automatic. Outside, Spokane was quiet, the streets pale and thin with ice. He walked, letting the cold bite through his gloves, grounding himself in sensation. He passed a coffee shop just opening, a man shoveling snow from a sidewalk, a woman scraping frost from a windshield. Ordinary life, continuing unbothered. That normalcy pressed against him, reminding him how far he stood from it. He did not head straight back to the enclosure. Instead, he circled, observation first. He needed context, patterns, something solid enough to justify action. He had learned the cost of acting on instinct alone. Once, overseas, he had intervened too quickly, misread a situation, and watched a fragile alliance collapse. The memory surfaced uninvited, tight and bitter. He had told himself he would never repeat that mistake. By late morning, he returned to the outskirts. The enclosure looked the same from a distance, no movement nearby. Ethan stayed hidden, watching. Time stretched. He let it. Patience had saved his life more times than aggression ever had. Eventually, the dog shifted, a small adjustment, as if sensing change rather than seeing it. Ethan felt a flicker of something like relief, irrational and unwelcome. The animal was still there. It had not been removed. It had not disappeared into some unseen consequence. He edged closer, careful not to announce himself. The dog's attention focused on him immediately. No sound, no warning, just awareness. Ethan felt again that internal friction, the tension between what he could do and what he should do. He crouched near the fence, keeping distance, letting his presence be known without forcing it. "I came back," he said quietly, as if that fact needed stating. He did not expect understanding, yet the dog did not retreat. Its posture remained controlled, coiled not with aggression, but readiness. Ethan wondered how long it had been since anyone approached without intent to harm or exploit. He wondered what that did to a mind shaped by command and loyalty. A noise broke the moment. Footsteps on gravel. Ethan straightened, turning as two men approached from the opposite side of the structure. They were not the same ones from yesterday. Their movements were slower, more cautious, as if they knew the place was wrong, but convenient. One of them glanced at Ethan, expression unreadable. "Didn't know anyone came out here?" the man said. His tone carried curiosity more than challenge. "Neither did I," Ethan replied. He kept his voice even, non-committal. He did not mention the dog. The men exchanged a look. "That thing yours?" the other asked, nodding toward the enclosure. "No," Ethan said. The word landed heavier than he expected. The first man shrugged. Place is abandoned. Been that way for a while. No one's watching it." Ethan absorbed the information, filed it away. Abandoned. No oversight, no accountability. The pattern was becoming clearer. The men moved on, losing interest quickly. Ethan watched them leave, aware that every interaction added pressure. The longer the dog stayed here, the greater the risk. He remained for another hour, simply existing in the dog's line of sight. He did not touch the fence again. He did not open the gate. He needed the dog to decide something on its own terms, even if that decision was only to continue watching. Trust built under force was not trust at all. Ethan understood that intimately. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature dropped further. The dog's breathing changed subtly, the cold working its way inward. Ethan felt a stab of anger then, sharp and focused, directed less at the men than at the system that allowed neglect to masquerade as inevitability. He thought of briefings that spoke of acceptable losses, of assets written off when maintenance outweighed value. The language was different, but the logic felt the same. A memory surfaced from his training days, something an instructor had said offhandedly after a failed exercise. "If you break what you can't control, don't be surprised when it breaks you back." At the time, Ethan had taken it as a warning about arrogance. Now, watching the dog endure, he understood another layer. Damage did not disappear just because it was ignored. As dusk approached, Ethan made his decision. Not a plan, not yet. Just a direction. He would not leave this unresolved. The shape of his involvement would depend on what he learned next, but walking away entirely was no longer an option. That realization settled with a strange calm. Uncertainty was familiar territory. Purpose, even undefined, steadied him. He stood and stepped back, preparing to leave again. The dog shifted a fraction closer to the fence. It did not follow. It did not call out. But its presence pressed against Ethan's awareness like a hand on his back. He wondered if the animal recognized the difference between someone who observed and someone who returned. He wondered if it understood promises made without words. As night fell, Ethan walked back toward the city. Thoughts aligned for the first time since his return. He would gather information. He would learn who had owned this place, who had trained the dog, who had decided abandonment was acceptable. He would proceed carefully, methodically. That was the only way this ended without more damage. Behind him, the enclosure sank into darkness. Inside it, the dog remained alert, waiting not in hope, but in expectation. Somewhere between them, a line had been drawn, thin and fragile, yet unbroken. Ethan felt it even as distance grew, a pull that promised consequences he could not yet see, but could no longer ignore. Late afternoon draped Spokane's outskirts in fading light, the cold deepening as abandoned ground shifts from neglect into something closer to a decision point. Ethan returned with intention this time, and the awareness of that intention unsettled him more than doubt ever had. He carried no tools, no leash, no plan that could be written down and justified. What he carried instead was a growing certainty that observation alone had reached its limit. The previous night had offered him little rest. Each time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed fragments, not as images, but as sensations. The weight of silence, the discipline embedded in stillness, the quiet defiance of waiting without permission to leave. Those sensations followed him now, shaping each step toward the enclosure. He approached slowly, careful not to announce urgency. Urgency belonged to situations spiraling out of control. This one, he told himself, required something else. The dog noticed him immediately, as it always did, attention sharpening, not with excitement, but with assessment. Ethan felt again that strange reversal of roles, the sense of being evaluated rather than evaluating. It reminded him of moments during joint operations when allies watched each other closely, gauging reliability before trust could form. He stopped several feet from the fence and sat down on the frozen ground. The decision surprised even him. Sitting placed him lower, reduced the implied dominance of standing over the enclosure. It was a small gesture, but gestures mattered when words meant little. He rested his hands on his knees and waited. Time passed without obvious change. The dog remained still. Ethan focused on breathing, slowing it deliberately. He let the cold seep in, anchoring him to the present. This was not negotiation. It was presence. In the field, he had learned that some doors opened only when force was absent. He wondered whether the dog's past had taught it the same lesson. A sound drifted from the distance, the faint echo of traffic. Civilization asserting itself without concern. Ethan felt a flicker of irritation at the contrast. People drove past unaware, insulated by routine. He envied that insulation, even as he recognized he no longer fit inside it. The life he had known before training felt like a borrowed memory, something he could describe but not inhabit. He spoke again, not because he expected response, but because silence alone felt incomplete. "I don't know how long you've been here," he said softly. "I don't know who left you." The words felt inadequate, blunt tools against something more complex. He paused, searching for honesty rather than comfort. "But I know what it's like to be useful until you're not." The dog shifted its weight slightly, not toward him, not away. Ethan noticed the restraint in that movement, the controlled economy. This was not fear-driven hesitation, it was calculation. The realization sent a ripple of respect through him. Whatever training had shaped this animal, it had not been casual. It had been deliberate, layered, and demanding. Ethan's thoughts drifted to his own instructors, to voices that emphasized endurance over expression. Pain was information, they had said. Emotion was noise unless harnessed. Control was everything. Looking at the dog now, Ethan saw the echo of those principles carried to a different form. He felt an unexpected kinship, one that unsettled him precisely because it felt unchosen. A memory surfaced, one he rarely allowed himself to revisit. A mission where extraction had been delayed, communication compromised. They had waited in place far longer than planned, listening to distant movement, counting seconds that stretched into something heavy and disorienting. One teammate had whispered a joke to break the tension. Another had stayed silent, conserving focus. Ethan had been the latter. Waiting, he had learned, could be more exhausting than action. Yet waiting was often what separated survival from catastrophe. The dog waited now with the same intensity. Ethan stood slowly, signaling departure. He did not want to push further, not yet. As he turned, a sound stopped him. Not a bark, not a whine, just the soft scrape of movement against the ground. He looked back. The dog had stepped closer to the fence, closing a small distance that had not been closed before. The gesture carried no plea, only acknowledgement. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He left again, but this time the distance felt different. It felt provisional. Over the next 2 days, Ethan returned repeatedly, varying the times, altering his approach. Each visit added a layer of understanding. He noticed patterns, the dog's heightened alertness at certain hours, its calm when he arrived alone, the way tension increased when unfamiliar footsteps echoed nearby. These observations confirmed what he already suspected. The dog was not simply surviving, it was monitoring, it was anticipating. On the 3rd day, Ethan encountered resistance of a different kind. A man approached as Ethan stood near the enclosure, older than the others, carrying himself with the wary confidence of someone who knew the edges of legality but lived comfortably just beyond them. He introduced himself with a name Ethan did not bother to remember and asked too many questions disguised as concern. Ethan answered little, offering nothing that could be used. "This place used to be something," the man said, glancing at the structure. "Not anymore." "Things don't stop being something just because people stop paying attention," Ethan replied. The man snorted, unimpressed, and walked away. The exchange left Ethan unsettled. Attention, he realized, was increasing. That changed the equation. The longer the dog remained here, the narrower the margin became. Ethan felt the pressure build, the familiar tightening that preceded decisive action. That night, Ethan weighed options he had not wanted to consider. Taking responsibility without authority carried risk. Leaving the dog meant accepting a consequence he was no longer willing to bear. He thought about ownership, about systems that defined worth through utility. He thought about the thin line between intervention and control, and how easily one became the other. When he returned the following morning, the dog was waiting closer to the fence than ever before, its attention fixed on him, unwavering. Ethan felt something shift then, subtle but irrevocable. This was no longer a question of if, but when. Whatever boundaries remained were eroding, replaced by a shared recognition of inevitability. Ethan did not act that day. He knelt again, extended nothing, demanded nothing. He allowed the moment to exist, suspended. The dog remained, neither retreating nor advancing further. Between them the air felt charged, as if a signal had been acknowledged but not yet answered. As Ethan finally turned away, he felt certainty settle alongside unease. He would need to move soon. Observation had done its work. The next step would change everything, for both of them. Behind the fence, the dog stayed alert, no longer merely enduring time, but measuring it. Somewhere in that shared calculation lay the beginning of a choice that could not be undone. Night clamps down on the abandoned outskirts, cold sharpening into something metallic as snow reflects pale light and turns the enclosure into a stage where waiting finally gives way to motion. Ethan felt the shift before it happened. It was not sound or sight that warned him, but the sudden tightening inside his chest, the same instinct that had pulled him awake moments before ambushes overseas. He was already moving when the first shadow crossed the edge of the lot. This time, he had not come to observe. He had come because the waiting had reached its breaking point. The dog sensed it too. Ethan did not need to look to know that. The presence behind the fence changed, no longer suspended in endurance, but aligned, alert, and ready. Whatever had been holding it back loosened, not into chaos, but into focus. Ethan felt a strange, involuntary surge of relief. Fear would have been easier to manage. This calm, this contained readiness demanded respect. Voices drifted in from the darkness, familiar in their cadence, even if the words were lost. The men from before had returned, and they were not alone. Their movements were louder now, less bored, edged with anticipation. Ethan's mind cataloged options automatically: distance, cover, timing. He told himself he could still walk away, still choose not to intervene. The lie barely registered before it dissolved. One of the men approached the enclosure, rattling the fence deliberately. The sound cut through the quiet like a challenge. Ethan felt anger rise, hot and focused, but he forced it down. Anger wasted energy. He stepped forward instead, making himself visible. "Leave," he said, his voice low, carrying farther than he intended. The word was not a request. The men turned, surprised. One laughed, sharp and brittle. Another cursed under his breath. They spread slightly, instinctively, reacting to Ethan's posture, even if they did not consciously register why. He saw it then, clearly. They were not dangerous because they were strong. They were dangerous because they were careless, accustomed to no resistance. "This doesn't concern you," one of them said. He took a step closer, testing. "It does now," Ethan replied. He kept his hands visible, relaxed, the way he had been trained to appear non-threatening just before becoming anything but. The fence rattled again, harder this time. The sound was different. It carried weight, intention. Ethan's attention snapped back to the enclosure. The dog had moved. not lunged blindly, not erupted in panic, but advanced with precision. Its presence filled the space behind the bars, not wild, not frenzied, but unmistakably activated. Ethan felt a flicker of disbelief cut through his focus. He had anticipated resistance, chaos, unpredictability. What he witnessed instead was discipline unfolding. The dog did not react to provocation until the threat crossed an invisible threshold. When it did, the response was immediate and decisive. The gate gave way, with a sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness. One of the men shouted. Another stumbled back. Ethan barely had time to register movement before the dog was among them. Not reckless, not uncontrolled. Each action served a purpose: distraction, disabling force, separation. Ethan watched, stunned, as years of buried training surfaced intact, unmarred by neglect or abuse. He moved then, instinctively, but realized almost immediately that he was not needed in the way he had expected. The dog worked through the men with terrifying efficiency, not out of rage, but out of function. Ethan had seen this before in human operators, the way training took over when conscious thought slowed things down. Seeing it now embodied in another form unsettled him deeply. One of the men tried to run. The dog cut him off without hesitation, forcing him to the ground and holding him there with pressure that communicated a clear message: stop or suffer further consequence. Another lashed out blindly, panic replacing bravado. The response was swift, precise, ending the threat without excess. Ethan felt his breath catch. This was not vengeance. This was correction. The confrontation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Snow settled again, disturbed only by labored breathing and muted groans. The men lay incapacitated, fear finally overtaking whatever sense of control they had believed themselves to possess. The dog stood between them and Ethan, alert, scanning, waiting for what came next. Ethan stared, heart pounding, not from exertion, but from realization. He had underestimated the depth of what he was dealing with. This was no abandoned asset that had degraded with time. This was a weapon that had been shelved without decommissioning, a force left dormant rather than dismantled. The implication sent a chill through him far colder than the night air. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan lowered his stance, signaling de-escalation. He did not approach the dog immediately. He respected the moment, the aftermath of activation. "It's over," he said quietly, unsure whether the words were meant for the men, the dog, or himself. The dog did not move toward him, but its posture shifted, tension easing fractionally without disappearing. Control, not exhaustion, governed the change. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance, drawn by noise and chance. Ethan knew this window was closing. He took one last look at the men, at the consequences of their choices now etched into the snow. There was no satisfaction in it, only a sober understanding of cause and effect. When he finally met the dog's gaze, something passed between them that required no translation. Recognition, alignment, a shared acknowledgement that the line between waiting and action had been crossed, and there was no returning to what had been before. Ethan felt an unexpected weight settle on him, heavy but steady. Responsibility, he realized, was not something assigned. It was something assumed. He turned away first, moving toward the darkness beyond the enclosure, trusting without proof that the dog would follow when ready. Footsteps crunched behind him, measured and close. Ethan did not look back immediately. He allowed the sound to exist, to become real, before accepting it. As they left the site behind, the abandoned structures fading into shadow, Ethan's thoughts raced ahead, mapping consequences he could not yet fully see. Whatever the dog had been, whatever it still was, could not remain here. The world had noticed, others would come, questions would follow, and buried beneath all of it was a truth that tightened his chest with equal parts awe and dread. He had just witnessed the return of something that had never truly been gone. Behind him the dog moved with purpose, no longer waiting out of endurance, but advancing out of choice. The night swallowed their path, leaving only disturbed snow and unanswered questions in its wake. Morning breaks cold and colorless over the forest line beyond Spokane, snow hanging in the air like unfinished thoughts as the cabin becomes a temporary refuge rather than a destination. Ethan woke to a different silence than before, one that no longer felt empty, but occupied, shared. The cabin was still, yet he was acutely aware that he was not alone in it. That awareness did not bring comfort exactly, but it brought steadiness, a sense that vigilance no longer rested solely on his shoulders. He sat up slowly, letting his eyes adjust, and noticed the dog already awake, positioned near the doorway, as if guarding a perimeter that had not been formally defined but instinctively understood. The events of the night before returned to him in fragments, not as chaos, but as clarity. There had been no panic, no loss of control. What unsettled him most was not the violence itself, but the precision with which it had ended. Ethan moved carefully, conscious that recovery after activation mattered as much as activation itself. He remembered handlers speaking in low tones after operations, emphasizing decompression, the importance of reestablishing safety before tension calcified into something dangerous. He applied the same logic now, even without a manual. He prepared water, food, warmth, offering routine rather than reassurance. The dog accepted each provision without hesitation, but also without the frantic gratitude Ethan might have expected. This was not dependence. It was acknowledgement. The distinction mattered. As the hours passed, Ethan observed subtle shifts. The dog rested, but not deeply. It remained aware of surroundings, tracking sound and movement with quiet efficiency. Ethan recognized the signs of controlled recovery, the same state he had often occupied himself, where rest existed alongside readiness. He felt an unexpected surge of respect, followed closely by unease. Whatever training lay beneath this behavior had been extensive, intentional, and recent enough to remain intact. By midday, something changed. The dog rose and moved toward the door with purpose, then stopped and looked back at Ethan. The look was not request or command, but invitation. Ethan hesitated. He had intended to remain here, to let the situation cool, to consider next steps from a position of relative obscurity. But the dog did not repeat the gesture. It waited, confident that Ethan would understand the implication without insistence. "Show me," Ethan said, surprising himself with how naturally the words came. He grabbed his jacket and followed. They moved through the trees, the dog setting a steady pace, not rushing, but not wandering. Ethan noticed how the animal chose its path, avoiding unnecessary noise, adjusting direction with minimal correction. This was navigation, not exploration. The realization tightened something in Ethan's chest. The destination, whatever it was, already existed in the dog's mind. The forest thinned, and familiar shapes emerged. From the snow, fencing partially collapsed, structures half swallowed by time. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. They had returned to the place where everything had begun, but now the space revealed itself differently. What he had first taken for neglect now bore the faint outlines of intention. Reinforced posts, cleared lines of sight, an old training ground disguised by decay. The dog stopped near a section of ground where snow had been disturbed, pawing lightly. Ethan knelt, brushing away the surface layer until metal glinted beneath. He uncovered a small compartment, sealed but not hidden well enough to withstand time. Inside lay remnants of purpose, degraded equipment, fragments of documentation rendered unreadable by moisture, and a collar. Ethan's breath caught as he lifted it. The collar was worn but not crude. Its design suggested function over appearance, durability over comfort. Engraved on the inner band were two names. One belonged to the dog, The other belonged to a man Ethan recognized instantly, not from personal acquaintance, but from reputation. A name spoken rarely and never casually within certain circles. A name associated with missions that officially did not exist, and outcomes that had reshaped operations without acknowledgement. Ethan felt a slow, creeping cold spread through him. Legends were dangerous things. They attracted distortion, myth, and misuse. Yet the weight of that name carried undeniable authority. Whoever had owned this dog had not been a contractor or enthusiast. He had been something else entirely, something that blurred the boundary between asset and operator. Beneath the collar lay a folded piece of material, sealed in plastic, protected with care that suggested foresight rather than hope. Ethan hesitated before opening it, aware that whatever he read could not be unread. He unfolded the paper slowly, recognizing the economy of language immediately. This was not a letter written for comfort. It was a warning. The message was brief, direct, stripped of sentiment. It spoke of danger not as possibility, but as certainty. It made clear that the dog was not merely trained to protect, but to draw attention, to expose, to disrupt. Anyone who kept the dog would inherit that danger. Anyone who tried to control it without understanding would fail. The final line unsettled Ethan most, a statement that protection flowed only one way, and only under specific conditions. The dog would defend its handler, but only if that handler accepted the full weight of what followed. Ethan sat back on his heels, mind racing. Pieces began to align, forming a picture far larger than he had anticipated. This was not abandonment, born of neglect. This was abandonment born of necessity, of erasure. Someone had decided that shutting down the program meant severing all ties, including those that still breathed. The dog had been left not because it was useless, but because it was too dangerous to reintegrate, and too valuable to destroy. He looked at the dog then, really looked, seeing not just presence but history. Whatever loyalty anchored this animal had survived isolation, abuse, and neglect without turning feral. That loyalty had simply waited, dormant, until recognition returned. Ethan felt the weight of the letter settle onto his shoulders, heavier than any pack he had carried. He had not sought inheritance, yet here it was. Questions crowded in. Who else knew about this place? Who else remembered the man whose name lay etched into metal? How long before someone connected the events of the previous night to what lay buried here? Ethan understood suddenly that obscurity was no longer an option. The story, whatever its full shape, had already begun to surface. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back alongside the collar, then secured both inside his jacket. The dog watched, attentive, as if gauging Ethan's response not for emotion, but for resolve. Ethan met that gaze and felt something settle between them, unspoken but definitive. This was no longer about rescue. It was about custody, about stewardship of something that could not be left unattended again. As they turned back toward the cabin, Ethan's thoughts moved ahead, calculating timelines, risks, responses. He did not yet know how quickly the world would close in, only that it would. The dog moved beside him, no longer leading, no longer following, but matching pace. The forest seemed quieter on the return, as if aware that something buried had been acknowledged and could not be returned to sleep. When the cabin came into view, Ethan paused briefly, looking back toward the training ground now half concealed by snow. He felt the pull of unanswered questions, the gravitational weight of legacy and consequence. Whatever had been set in motion years ago had not ended with abandonment. It had simply waited, patient and exacting, for someone willing to accept the terms. Inside the cabin, Ethan set the collar and letter on the table, their presence altering the space immediately. He knew that rest would be brief, that decisions would need to be made sooner than he preferred. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying sound farther than before. Ethan listened, attuned to the shift, understanding with growing certainty that the quiet he had relied upon was already thinning. Snow thickens around the cabin as daylight fades early, the forest closing in with a quiet that feels observed rather than empty, turning shelter into a threshold instead of a refuge. Ethan did not sleep. He tried, sitting with his back to the wall and the room dimmed to a dull amber, but rest refused to settle. The letter lay folded on the table beside the collar, both exerting a gravity that bent every thought toward consequence. He had learned to recognize that feeling long ago, the moment before momentum took control, when preparation mattered more than certainty. The dog remained nearby, alert but composed, as if the cabin had become a perimeter that existed only because they both accepted it as such. He began with restraint. No sudden movement, no abrupt decisions. He catalogued what he had and what he lacked, not in lists, but in instincts honed by repetition. The cabin was defensible only in theory. It was isolated, which offered time but not safety. Isolation worked until it didn't. The noise from the night before would travel through rumor faster than sound ever could, and rumor was how attention found places meant to remain forgotten. Ethan's gaze returned to the collar. Something about its weight felt wrong, heavier than metal alone could explain. He turned it slowly, running his thumb along the inner seam, not searching so much as listening with his hands. The click was soft, almost apologetic, when a concealed compartment released. Inside, no larger than a matchbox, lay a device Ethan recognized instantly, not because he had used one exactly like it, but because he had once been briefed on its existence. Compact, redundant, designed to survive erasure. He felt a tightening behind his eyes, the kind that accompanied both discovery and dread. The device fit into a reader he kept for benign reasons, or so he had once believed. He hesitated only a moment before connecting it. Hesitation had its place, but so did clarity. The screen flickered, then filled with fragments of recorded memory, angles too low for a human perspective, movement calibrated for speed, timestamps stripped of context. The footage was disorienting at first, but meaning emerged quickly. He watched sequences of training that bore no resemblance to conventional programs. The commands were minimal, the expectations absolute. The dog moved through environments that changed faster than rules could be spoken, responding not to instruction, but to intent. Ethan recognized the methodology immediately. This was not about obedience. This was about autonomy under constraint, the creation of an asset that could operate without constant guidance and still align with mission parameters. He felt a chill settle deeper than the cold outside. The recordings shifted, locations changed, the tone darkened. Ethan saw exchanges that had nothing to do with training, captured incidentally rather than deliberately, men whose faces were partially obscured, packages transferred, signals exchanged that did not belong to any legitimate chain of command. The dog was present throughout, not as subject, but as witness. The realization struck him hard. This was not collateral data. This was evidence. Ethan shut the device down slowly. His breathing felt too loud in the small space. Whatever organization had been operating here had not simply vanished. It had buried itself, shedding layers while leaving traps behind. The dog was one of those traps, a living archive that could not be wiped clean. No wonder the letter had warned so bluntly. Keeping the dog meant inheriting the attention of people who preferred secrets to remain unchallenged. He looked toward the window, scanning the tree line for movement that might already be there. The dog rose without prompting, posture tightening, senses aligned. Ethan did not need confirmation. The world had shifted. The question was no longer whether danger would come, but how soon and from which direction. He moved then, purpose crystallizing into action without haste. He did not transform the cabin into a fortress. That kind of thinking led to static failure. Instead, he prepared for delay, for signaling, for endurance. He reinforced what could be reinforced, cleared what needed to remain clear, and accepted what could not be changed. When he fitted protective gear onto the dog, he did so carefully, aware that the gesture carried meaning beyond function. The dog accepted it without resistance, not because it was trained to submit, but because it recognized intent aligned with survival. Ethan's thoughts returned to the letter's final line, the warning about protection flowing only one way. He understood it now, not as threat, but as condition. The dog would defend him because it had been shaped to defend the mission, and for now, Ethan represented continuity rather than command. That distinction mattered. Control would break this fragile alignment. Trust, however provisional, might sustain it. The device went back into the collar, secured as it had been before, hidden in plain sight. Ethan knew that discovery was inevitable if he waited long enough. He had no intention of waiting. He activated a signal he had hoped never to use again, one designed to cut through bureaucracy rather than terrain. The act felt heavier than he expected, not because of fear, but because it acknowledged that this had outgrown solitude. Whatever came next would involve others, and others complicated everything. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying sound in irregular patterns. The dog reacted instantly, moving to a position that offered sight without exposure. Ethan followed suit, his focus narrowing into the familiar clarity that preceded engagement. He did not feel excitement. He felt readiness, tempered by responsibility. The footage he had seen replayed behind his eyes, each frame reinforcing the same conclusion. The threat was organized, patient, and accustomed to operating unseen, time compressed. Minutes felt like seconds, seconds like nothing at all. Ethan adjusted his stance, listening not just with his ears, but with his body, attuned to subtle changes in pressure and rhythm. The dog mirrored him, not copying, but synchronizing. Whatever had been done to shape this animal had created a partner capable of independent judgment, and that capability now stood between them and whatever approached. He considered destruction then, briefly, burning the evidence, erasing the trail, letting the past remain buried. The thought passed quickly, dismissed with the efficiency of someone who had already paid the cost of such choices. Truth, once seen, demanded response. Anything less would be complicity. The first sign came not as movement, but absence. The forest went quiet, in a way that felt deliberate, as if sound itself had been instructed to withdraw. Ethan's pulse slowed, sharpening rather than spiking. He knew this feeling too well. The dog's posture shifted, weight redistributing, attention locked onto a point Ethan could not yet see. He took one last look around the cabin, imprinting the space into memory. Whatever happened next would redefine it. Shelter could become battlefield in an instant, and survival would depend on choices made before that transformation occurred. Ethan steadied himself, not with bravado, but with acceptance. The signal was out. Help might come, or it might not come in time. Either way, the line had been drawn. As the first distant sound reached him, indistinct but intentional, Ethan felt a calm settle over him that surprised even himself. He was no longer reacting to circumstance. He was responding to obligation. Beside him, the dog remained poised, eyes forward, embodying a readiness born not of fear, but of purpose reclaimed. Whatever crossed the forest line next would find neither of them unprepared. Before dawn, snow whipped sideways around the cabin, wind carrying distant engines through the trees as the forest tightens, turning isolation into a crucible where intent, loyalty, and consequence converge. Ethan felt the first impact as vibration through the floor rather than sound, the kind that traveled through bone before air, and he adjusted instinctively, body aligning with angles he had memorized long ago when rooms turned hostile without warning. The dog was already moving, not toward the noise but toward the space between noise and shelter, attention narrowing into a precise corridor that excluded everything irrelevant. Ethan did not speak. Words would add friction. He shifted instead, signaling readiness without command, and felt the alignment settle, the fragile balance between autonomy and coordination snapping into place as if it had always existed. Outside, shapes emerged at the tree line, disciplined rather than frantic, spacing measured, approach deliberate. This was not a mob and not curiosity, it was retrieval. Ethan understood then that the organization he had glimpsed through stolen footage had not come to negotiate or intimidate. They had come to erase what remained, and he was standing where erasure failed. The first exchange broke the quiet with controlled violence, not loud, but decisive, a probing strike meant to test response and reveal habits. Ethan let it pass without reply, absorbing the rhythm, counting breaths, calibrating distance. The dog moved with him, not mirroring but anticipating, cutting angles Ethan could not see, and holding space where time thinned and mistakes multiplied. When the second approach came, closer and less patient, Ethan answered, not with force for its own sake, but with interruption, breaking momentum at its source. The forest fractured into vectors of motion, snow torn into brief spirals by passage and impact, and through it all, the dog advanced with a clarity that stripped the chaos of meaning. Ethan felt the weight of it, the unbroken thread of training that had survived abandonment and abuse, the refusal to become feral, the insistence on purpose even when purpose had been denied. A burst of fire forced Ethan back toward the cabin, wood splintering, air tasting sharp and metallic, and he adjusted again, drawing threat into narrower lanes where it lost advantage. He caught glimpses of faces without features that mattered, saw coordination degrade as surprise replaced confidence, and he pressed that opening not with haste, but with inevitability. The dog did not hesitate when the moment demanded sacrifice. Ethan sensed the decision before it happened, a shift that felt like gravity changing direction, and he turned too late to stop it. The impact landed with a sound he would carry long after the snow filled the print, a blunt punctuation that silenced a line of fire meant for him. The dog absorbed it without cry, momentum breaking but not purpose, buying seconds that cost more than seconds. Ever should. Ethan's breath tore free of his chest, the world narrowing to a single unacceptable fact, and then training reasserted itself, harsh and necessary, pushing him forward because stopping would make the sacrifice meaningless. He closed distance with a precision sharpened by fury he did not allow to bloom, ended the immediate threat, and dragged himself back to the dog as engines surged closer and the forest shuddered under arrival. The signal he had sent answered itself then, not as hope, but as certainty. Rotor wash, flattening snow, and intent alike, voices cutting through with authority that did not need explanation. Ethan held pressure where it mattered, hands steady despite the tremor that threatened to undo him, speaking softly without words that promised anything he could not control. The dog remained with him, not panicked, not fading into absence, attention still anchored, as if duty could outlast pain if acknowledged properly. The firefight collapsed into restraint and custody. The men who had come to erase, now catalogued as evidence themselves, their confidence drained by daylight and law arriving together. Ethan did not look up when the team secured the perimeter. He knew their rhythm, their competence, and trusted it. He focused on the singular truth before him, the bond forged not by ownership but by recognition, and he felt the letter's warning echo in a new register. Protection flowed only one way, it had said, and he understood now that it meant not control, but commitment, the willingness to stand where danger would inevitably return. When the medic arrived, calm and efficient, Ethan relinquished nothing that mattered, allowing care without surrendering presence, and when the dog was stabilized, he felt a release so profound it left him hollow for a moment, a silence deeper than the one he had known before this began. As the sun broke the horizon, thin and unforgiving, the forest gave up its secrets, revealing disturbed ground, spent casings, and the outline of a story that would not be buried again. Ethan briefed when asked, concise and exact, offering facts without embellishment, because truth was sharp enough on its own. The evidence moved into hands designed to protect it, the recordings no longer a living archive carried alone, but a catalyst that would expose a network built on the assumption that abandonment equaled disappearance. Later, when the noise receded and the cabin returned to being just wood and shadow, Ethan sat beside the dog and allowed himself to breathe fully for the first time since Spokane had taught him to wait. He did not promise outcomes. He did not claim redemption. He acknowledged survival, alignment, and the cost they carried together. The dog met that acknowledgment with presence rather than affection, a steadiness that did not ask to be named, and Ethan understood that pride did not require ceremony to exist. In the days that followed, the story surfaced with restraint rather than spectacle, names spoken in delight, corridors closed that had thrived on darkness, and the myth of erasure finally dismantled by persistence instead of force. Ethan declined commendation and accepted responsibility, choosing a quieter path that allowed the dog to remain what it had always been at its core, not an asset reclaimed, but a partner recognized. When they left the forest for the last time, snow already softening the scars, Ethan felt no triumph, only a settled resolve that felt like belonging. The world had tried to discard what it could not easily manage, and in doing so had created a test. It failed. Ethan and the dog walked forward together, not as legend or warning, but as proof that loyalty, once honored, could outlast cruelty and turn survival into something like peace. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder from the sky or angels we can see. Sometimes the miracle is quiet endurance, a soul that survives cruelty, a heart that chooses loyalty when the world chooses abandonment. In this story, the miracle was not just survival, it was recognition. God often works through those who refuse to look away, through those who listen when others ignore, through bonds that form not by chance, but by purpose. In everyday life, we may pass by broken places, wounded souls, or silent suffering, thinking it is not our responsibility. But perhaps God places these moments in our path for a reason, not to test our strength, but to awaken our compassion. One choice, one act of courage, one moment of faith can change a life forever. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than a story. Share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment to honor those who protect the innocent, both human and animal. Subscribe to this channel so more light can reach places still hidden in darkness. And may God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you in every unseen battle you face. You are not alone. Amen.